Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this month's installment of Democracy and Vulnerability, in partnership with the Venda Museum, Thomas Mann House, and Dub Lab Radio. We're happy that you are here, be it with us on Zoom or listening via air. My name is Emma Larson, and I, along with the rest of our student council, am very excited to welcome journalist and author Friedemann Karig as today's interviewee. Democracy and Vulnerability is a program that reflects upon the current state of democracy at a local, national, and global level. Democracy, an organizational structure that vests power to the people that exist within it, is dynamic, inclusive, and communal. And it's also probably because of this very inclusivity, messy, contradictory, and vulnerable. Friedemann Karig, a 2024 Thomas Mann House Fellow, was interested in protest culture in the United States, is sure to add a productive lens to the all-important discussions that exist at the contentious intersection between democracy and the many vulnerabilities that define it. Born and raised in Germany and a current resident of Berlin, Karig is academically grounded in a mixture of media studies, literature, sociology, politics, and economics. His first book, How We Love, was published in 2017, followed by the best-selling Narrating Apes, Myths, Lies, and Utopias, which considers the way that the stories humans tell ourselves about ourselves impact our lives. Along the way, Karig has also published 2 novels, speaking to the creativity and interdisciplinarity that he embeds in all of his work. And as a 2024 Thomas Mann House Fellow, Karig is currently working on a forthcoming book entitled What You Want, How Protest Really Works, which will explore the myriad factors that encourage disaffected people to use activism and protest to generate change within a democratic system. Analyzing both historical and contemporary protest movements, Karig illustrates how communities, through protest, can often achieve more than initially seems possible, an optimistic stance that can help us to recognize the ways that we, though vulnerable, can use the tools of activism to make our democracies work for us. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited for what our conversation today will hold. The program will feature a 1-hour discussion with Friedemann Karig, moderated by student council member Zora Nelson. And I, along with members Matthew Jones and Elsa Cooney, will also be posing questions to Friedemann as we work together to engage and craft a fruitful discussion about some of the most important issues facing our democracy today. On behalf of the entire Student Council, Friedemann, it is a pleasure to have you with us. We'd also like to extend our thanks to Susan Horowitz and Rook Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Venda. And Zora, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for a great introduction, Emma. I'm Zora, as mentioned, and welcome to the series, Friedemann. We are very honored to have you with us today. I think Emma honestly has the perfect question to kick things off and set the conversation with an understanding of why you do what you do, honestly. So I'm going to pass it back to Emma.
My question, as simple as it sounds, I think probably has more to it, but why do you feel that studying protest culture, be it American or otherwise, why is it important now in this moment?
Thank you very much for a very good first question, which is actually quite tough. And thanks, of course, for the great introduction and all the praise. I don't know if I deserve it. And thank you, Zora, for hosting this interview. And thanks to all of you listening and letting me torture you with my German accent. I hope it's bearable for the next hour. So why protest culture and why now? The thing is, I started this project and I started thinking about protest in a professional way, not only as a citizen, but as an author, somebody who's blessed to call his job like trying to understand something, trying to educate myself, and then to explain it back to a broader public. So I started this, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And back then in Germany, there was this big Fridays for Future movement, like the climate justice movement, erupting for the first time, bringing millions on the street, which was historical at that point in 2019. So that was the first kickoff, like asking myself, and of course the science and the sources I could find, does it work? What does it bring into the world? Like what kind of political change, what kind of societal change, what kind of cultural change can be achieved by these kind of mass protests? And I started working on this and looking at the discourse through these lenses of like a protest scholar in the beginning that I was. And then the climate movement shifted, or let's say there was another group called Let's Generation, Last Generation. It's comparable to Extinction Rebellion or Just Stop Oil in the UK. I don't think you really have something like that in the US, but maybe you can tell me something more about that. So, and they shifted tactics. They used tactics of civil disobedience, and they actually blocked streets. And I'm sure you're familiar with the museum protest when they threw tomato soup or potato salad at the glasses that are protecting these paintings. So yeah, that was a completely different kind of protest. So I saw that as a chance to compare these kind of protests, like this mass protest on the streets and these disruptive, smaller civil disobedience protests. And of course, if you ask me today, like in February 24, why now? I can tell you that I consider myself lucky, because I don't know if you are familiar with this, but in Germany in the recent weeks and months, we had the like historical big mass protest against the far right, against the AfD, like that's the party in Germany. And we saw 100,000, even millions take it to the streets against these right-wing extremists and their success in recent times. So yeah, I couldn't think of a better timing for the book actually, but it's like not my achievement. I got lucky in a way.
Thank you. That's honestly, that's very admirable. And honestly, obviously it's no like secret that current times often influence, just our desire to really make a change. So that honestly does make sense. And something I noticed is that in addition to your interest in politics, you also have a very creative brain. And while scrolling through your texts, I noticed that you frequently touch on themes that involved, again, very creative, fictitious, and sometimes fantastical elements that often explore some deep or philosophical questions. And with this, I wanted to ask that would you say that your evidently very creative brain informs your viewpoints with politics?
That's so beautiful that what you just said. Like I never thought about it that way. It just comes to me naturally. I think as every one of us, I kind of feed on stories. I kind of live by the stories I digest in a way, and it shapes my worldview definitely. And on the other hand, like I think in politics nowadays we seriously lack fantasy. And I think fantasy as an ability to see the world and how the world could be is a muscle. We have to train it. We have to do something. We have to work out. It's like hope. Hope and fantasy is very much connected, I think. And like working on the book, for example, I looked at how people in the 1960s and 70s, in this era of, in a way, of a freedom movement, how they thought about what society, what politics could be. And I noticed, it's not something very original, but it came to me naturally when I read these texts. They had a kind of utopian way of thinking. They thought about a revolution. They didn't think about small steps of incremental change. They thought about changing the whole system. And I don't want to judge if that was right or that would be right today. I'm just judging by how self-aware and how intellectually powerful protest has been in former times until now, and where we are today. Today, the most powerful protest to me is fighting for quite, in a way, quite small steps, like, for example, and discrimination, like, and racism, or and like climate destruction. These are things you would say you don't have to explain why this is important. Of course, you have to fight for them, and of course, there's a long path like ahead of us. We have to go until we achieve something. But if you compare it to former times, people were really thinking about like utopian scenarios, like a totally egalitarian, totally just society. And this definitely changed. And I think that thinking in stories, thinking in fantasies, can maybe lead us and empower us to to a state of mind where this utopian thinking has a place again.
Thank you for such a beautiful answer. Fantasy, I know something that I know that you said is that fantasy has an ability to see the world, which I feel like is very true. And that's a really like sweet way of looking at that. And I also I'm a writer myself, and I also hold a lot of value to stories. And I do also think that they definitely can empower. So thank you for that answer. To kind of shift gears a little bit, Emma has a question about your research on protest culture in the US versus globally, and kind of the comparative lens that is used between the two.
Yeah, I think already you brought up different kinds of protest, like, marching peacefully versus throwing tomato soup at a painting, or like small incremental change versus radical utopia. And so with both those specific examples of different kinds of protest, but also in general, I'm curious if the comparative lens that you take towards your study of protest, if that allows you to gain a sense of the kinds of protests or the factors that make certain protest movements more successful than others. What protest strategies can we use to make real and long-lasting change?
Thank you so much, Emma. You're pointing directly at the, let's say, reason why this book exists. Like, I didn't want to write a book about like slogans and songs and trivia and anecdotes. They're in the book as well because you need them. But I wanted to know what works and why. And to quote nobody else than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., there's no neat little tactic to turn the struggle for revolutionary change into a mere pushing of buttons. This doesn't work. But there are many, many things we can learn from former protest movements, and it doesn't really matter like what they wanted and when they wanted it. But it does matter how exactly did they achieve it. What kind of mechanisms you can identify by zooming out of the picture and zooming in again and zooming out and be like, okay, back then, like the suffragettes in the UK in the 1910s and 20s, they did something quite similar to Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, the 50s and 60s in the US, and like Dutch climate protests last year when they blocked a highway in Den Haag, in the capital of the Netherlands, and achieved something nobody would have thought that could be achieved, to bring the parliament to vote on fossil subsidies. And I think that's in a way that's the magic of protests, that there are certain rules you can define and you can follow, but on the other hand, like following Dr. King here, context matters so much that you could never just 100% just transfer a tactic or a way or something from this to that. That never happens. And of course, I talked to a lot of activists, especially in Germany, that are frustrated because the German government is not really acting on their behalf. They're not listening. And in Germany, as I said, we had the biggest mass protest for the climate, I think, in the whole world. And not enough happened. And they know all this. Like when I talk to these guys, and I'm like these are here's the theory, here's what they did, and this is very smart. You should do this. They're like, yeah, of course we know because it's in the books. We studied the history, and it still doesn't work. So that's kind of humbling in a way, and it shows you that the one thing that protest is always, it's a long-term fight. It's never short-term.
I honestly think that is so true, that if you look amongst even like movements today, whether it's climate change or Black Lives Matter or Women's March, I feel like although seemingly very different, it's interesting where you see a lot of these demonstrations do, you know, use some of the same tactics, which I also feel like it's very interesting. But I do agree with what you said, that context does matter too, especially now with things shifting to social media. And I think we have a question about that later on. But while we're talking about protest tactics right now, I know Matt had a question kind of about your approach to your own personal organizing and how the study of movements, protest movements, affects or informs your own like personal endeavors.
Perfect. Yeah. Well, bouncing off of the question we just had about context and how you're approaching different organizing strategies, I was just curious, is there a fundamentally different way that you would approach organizing a protest on behalf of a movement that would be, or a policy that would be broadly popular versus one that has yet to gain popular traction, but that you're hoping would gain popular traction? So kind of starting from, you know, a position of marginality versus a position of potentially, you know, let's say something like, you know, access to abortion rights is generally a popular, you know, political stance within the American population, and yet it's still something that we need to get to the streets and advocate for because it is under threat by minority opinions, versus something like various elements of like trans healthcare that are yet to get above 50% in terms of popular opinion, but are still something important that we should advocate for.
Thank you, Matt. That's a great question that I think I'm not able to completely answer because that's kind of complex. But in the book, I found a quite interesting example of the history of same-sex marriage in the US, which is kind of similar to the history of this in Germany. And of course, I'm sure you at least know like Harvey Milk and the whole struggle beginning in the 1970s. That's a very good example, like what you're talking about. There are like topics or policies that are just, that should be there, like and that are in the Constitution. I mean, that was the argument the guys back then made from the beginning. They said, like, in the Constitution said that everybody is equal to the right, so why can't we marry like men and men and women? And still it took, you could say it took the movement, or it took the public, or it took the discourse a long time until they achieved what you just referred to. They achieved like the 50% critical mass tipping point, and still that didn't help, like, for a long time. And I know this kind of about the US, but I'm not for sure in Germany. You had the majority on your side. Like, the majority said, yeah, sure, of course, same-sex marriage, why not? But in Germany, it was like 15 years until it materialized policy-wise. And I think in the US, it needed a Supreme Court decision in 2000. I'm not quite sure, 15, am I wrong? Something like that. So, I mean, and Harvey Milk died in 79, I guess. So it's a long time and a long struggle. So yeah, that's definitely a difference. The first task of protest, of course, is first of all raising awareness. That alone does nothing but like breaking the status quo, like breaking the normal life, like and showing people there's something that is not right, and you have to care about it. And then, of course, you need to gain traction. You need to mobilize. You need to not like the movement needs to not die, because like similar to startups, to companies, like many have a good idea, but many die in the first 2 years because execution is hard. Same for movements. You can have a good idea, you can have momentum, and then somebody else is important. Somebody starts a war, and that's it. So you have to do this. And then when you gain traction, you gain momentum, and you convince people one by one, and your media coverage and everything, then you can still have like 30, 40, 50, 60% of the population theoretically in your favor, but actually they don't care. Like actually at least half of them is like, yeah, if you call them like and you ask them, do you want same-sex marriage, yes or no, they might be saying yes, but they're never going to do anything in your favor, and they don't even vote in that direction. So you have to turn like yes sayers and maybe sayers into active participants, and you have to turn these active participants into fighters for the cause. And that takes sometimes a long time, and then you have to attack the opportunistic middle, like in between. There's always many people who shift their opinions and shift their support with the wind, and you have to show them that it's easier to support you than be against you. This is often a moral question, and then there's always a tipping point, and then like everything goes in your direction. And in the case of same-sex marriage, it's interesting because a guy called Bill Clinton supported was against it for a long time. He even, I think, somewhere in the 90s, they made a bill, like the Democrats under him made a bill against same-sex marriage explicitly, and in the end, like he fell because he was like optimistic enough to see like, okay, I cannot win this case. Like sooner or later, it's going to be 70, 80%. Sooner or later, like, I'm going to lose votes about this. So I'm gonna change my point of view. Same with Angela Merkel, our ex-chancellor in Germany, who was against it until she wasn't. And of course, this is a very, very long struggle. And on the other hand, if you start and you have the majority on your side in the first place, but not the politicians, you just like, have to bring the pressure from the public on the politicians by bringing them into a dilemma situation. For example, these climate protests I just talked about in the Netherlands, they put on a dilemma on the highway, in the most important highway in the capital of the city, and they said, because we have so much support from the public, and we turned so many of them over the course of the last years into active fighters, into people that are really, really willing to do something about it and to get, in the worst case scenario, get thrown into jail for their belief. We're gonna block this highway until you react, and you have two very bad choices. You can like put 1,000, 2,000 people a day in jail, normal citizens, and they send in minors and pupils, so get even better headlines. And on one day last fall, I think in September or October, the police, they had to throw 1,800 pupils, like 14, 15, 16 years old, into jail. That's not a good way for democratic government. Or you have to act accordingly, or you have to change. And you might not like it, but that might be the better option right now. And then you won. Sounds very easy, but it's very hard to achieve.
Yeah, as someone who's organized before myself, I'd say that the active participant part is honestly probably the most difficult thing, and where a lot of organizations struggle. So I do think that's very real in terms of organizing and the effectiveness, I guess, of certain movements. To kind of shift topics a little bit, I'm going to hand things over to Elsa, who had a question specifically about the rise of far-right movements and resistance in Germany, and your thoughts on that in terms of democracy.
Hi, Friedemann. Thank you so much for joining us. You spoke briefly about these historic protests against the far right happening in Germany. And I know that the AfD is polling alarmingly high nowadays. There has been a rise in sort of even more extremist fringe far right movements. I know among farmers specifically that speak about resistance on sort of a larger scale, and calling for an uprising against the government. And although a lot of people, including the Chancellor Olaf Scholz, have sort of dismissed these movements as nonsense, do these threats from extremist fringe groups in Germany and elsewhere hold a real threat to our democratic processes, or should they sort of be dismissed as like a few crazy internet trolls?
Thank you, Elsa. I see you're very well informed about German politics nowadays. And no, I think we should take these aggressive anti-democratic protests and movements very seriously, especially in connection with the AfD and the possibility that they come to power in some states in Germany this September, when there are 3 very important elections in Eastern Germany, and the European Parliament in May as well. So I think it's very important that the majority in Germany, the middle of society, as we used to say, that there's a change happening right now. People are afraid. They have been afraid before, but they now believe that they can do something against that, like individually and collectively. And it's funny because now I'm getting asked, because of the book, and people know that I'm working on protests. I'm getting asked a lot from Germany in interviews and privately. Does it work at all? Like, can you fight right-wing extremism? Can you fight a right-wing party or these movements by like mass protest on the street? And the truth is, yeah, you can. The science is pretty clear on this. We have very good, very solid research from Italy, France, and Greece, actually, where they tried something similarly on a local level. And I know especially the stuff they did in Italy in 2020, and there was a grassroots movement called the Sardines, and they could diminish the turnout for the right-wing party significantly by 10%. So, and sometimes that's all it takes. And I think that's a measure we really have to use in Germany right now, and it's being used. So yeah, you have to take them seriously, and you have to fight them via peaceful protest. And you can. It works. It does something, and then you can learn. Protest is always failing better. Like nobody, not Mahatma Gandhi, no Martin Luther King, nobody had with the first try hit the bullseye. It doesn't work like this. Like, society is a complex thing, politics is complex, and you have to try it out. And on the other hand, I talk for Germany, which I know. I would like to ask you back in a way, if you see the possibility of something like a broad protest movement against Trump this year, and how it could look like, and or if you see it as impossible, why not? Why are people not demonstrating against him?
I think people are tired, and yeah, there's a sense that the system is so broken that that we can go out and protest, but that's not going to change who the candidates are. Yeah, I mean, that's my own personal. I remember in 2016, I felt I was really motivated to change the political system and really actively was organizing in the Women's March. And it is interesting that like that is just not where my head is. And like I have to, you know, come to terms with that and like think about what that means morally for myself. But it's just when you fight for so long and things don't change in the way that you're talking about, like a utopian restructuring, I think it's hard to not lose hope. I'd be curious to hear what other people think, though.
Yeah, the first thing that came to mind is I think there's a sense of not inhabiting even the same sort of political or material reality as people who disagree with us really strongly now. Like there's a sense in kind of American culture of this idea that polarization has reached such a peak that we're no longer really operating out of even the same basic facts on the ground about what is happening, who is even in power, what are the actual, you know, threats facing our country, or what actually can be or ought to be discussed. And so I think and this was part of actually my next question to you, which we can circle back to later if you'd like, which is, you know, on the one hand, you very clearly say in your tweets or even in some of your writings that it's important that we identify, say these, you know, nascent fascist movements as antagonists, right? That there's clear sort of, you know, antagonist and protagonist categories here. We cannot let that group, you know, of fascists pretend that they're actually the silent majority and that they are in any way some respectable, you know, viable political group that needs to be taken seriously in a sense, right? But in the States, at least, the language is sort of massive existential threat. Like each party is seen by the other party as the ultimate existential threat to the country. If they win, it's game over. You know, there's no hope beyond that. And every sort of emotion is dialed up to 11. And on the one hand, right, I absolutely agree with you, right? I think it's important that we are able to name, you know, evil or name something that's politically dangerous. And then also at the same time, though, I feel this sense of the impending loss of the ability to hold political conversations and to speak a similar political language with people who disagree with us politically. I think possibly a part of that is because I incorrectly believe that there aren't many people who are sort of waffling in the middle. I think at this point, having been politically involved for a really long time, the idea of people not having made up their minds is strange to me, but also that might be the case, right? And maybe there is this large group of unpersuaded, you know, Americans who are going to respond well to these sorts of dialogues. So I was just curious what you might think on that.
Thanks very much for reading my tweets thoroughly. I think it's a very nice feeling to have American clever students like I think using Google Translate, I guess.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah, I don't know about you, Drew. But yeah, that's very nice. Thank you. So yeah, like theoretically speaking, first of all, about my idea, my little theory of protagonist, antagonist, and trying to have a productive polarization between these two, and to clearly divide topic wise, say like you can be either like for something or against it. You can be either for justice for all and equality or against it in this case. And there's no gray zone anymore. This is what protest has to do. And you're absolutely correctly right to refer to it like this. When I try to like now use it on the American case right now, like on the American political landscape, I have to say I'm not a really big expert on American politics. Even though like these 3 months you taught me a lot, and I do understand much better your problems, and I do understand Trump much better. But I think there are still some like gains to be made if you think really strategically, like, and the kind of mistake, I'd say, not judging, are the kinds of like fallacy many people make, not saying that you do it, but many people look at the political landscape, on the discourse, on a controversy, and they think they have to convince like all of the opponents, or at least the majority of the opponents, to win. Like in a game, you know, in sports, you have to score more goals than the opponent. This is not true. It of course it defines it depends on what you define as winning. But the good thing about Protestant politics is you can set the goalposts of your success, and if you like narrow down like the case of success enough, then it becomes possible. And for example, just thinking freely, correct me if I'm wrong, please. If you would like look at one swing state, and you say like, in this state could like decide this super important election, and we want to prevent one candidate from winning by all means necessary, and we're looking, because we're not so many, we don't have the funds, we don't have the people, what we can identify one swing state, and then in the swing state we are looking at the voters and the discourse and everything very closely, and we identify 1 or 2 or 3 topics that will decide this vote. And I get the impression from reading the newspaper basically that, for example, anti-abortion or abortion laws might be decisive for not like for many female voters, especially somewhere. Then you can work on this. Then you can like zoom in and be like, okay, maybe we can change by some means a couple of percent, and that in the end can really make a difference. And then you get the feeling of empowerment in the first place. And then the goal is so much smaller that you as a group you can convince yourself that you might have a chance, because protest always in the history of protest, I found one thing that was always the same. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It never has security of winning. It never has, hardly ever has the odds for him. It's always against the odds. It's always an uphill battle, and you might fail miserably. But that's the beauty of it. And the bigger goal, like preventing somebody really dangerous from entering the White House a second time, might be worth like doubling down on the efforts, and think even more strategically.
I'd be curious, before we move too far away from like Matt's point of like a protagonist and antagonist in these 2 different camps, and whether or not we're speaking the same language, whatever that means, but like, do you think we're also using the same protest mechanisms? Like, I'm curious if in your studies, I don't know a lot about the far right in Germany. I'm more familiar with a Russian context, and I know that this is the case, but in your work, have you seen examples of far right movements co-opting strategies that liberal protests have used to further their own aims? And do you ever worry about that like, you know, by speaking about the things that make protests successful, you're also empowering people that will push forward goals that you do not agree with?
Thank you. That's Emma. That's a very important question that I get a lot, actually, and I still don't have a perfect answer to it. I'm still finding my way, because of course, I would never debate this. People who believe, people from the far right, people who think democracy is not the best system, fascists, neo-fascists, neo-Nazis, racists, they can read, and they are not totally like stupid, and they could read a book like mine, of course, and they can read all the other much better books that are out there. They can like learn, study the tactics, and of course they can exercise it. We don't see this too much until here, and I'm still trying to figure out why, because it cannot be the education, and it cannot be the willpower they have, and they think of themselves as underdogs, and they think of themselves as protagonists. So why shouldn't they use these tactics? And I think like one reason why they don't use it, and I think they know they don't work that well for them. It's because protest is always, as the terms protagonist and antagonist might be telling you already, it's always kind of a narrative of ethics. It's always kind of explaining something in the structure of protagonist and antagonist, but the important part is the bigger moral about it. For example, should all citizens in a democracy be equal and be treated equally and have the same rights? Yes or no? That's a big ethical question. I think we all would answer yes. And then you would be like, yeah, then they should be able to marry whoever they love. So, and to this question, there we have the productive polarization, but it only works if we agree on the higher ethics. Everybody should be treated equal. Of course, you always have in a society like in Germany, yes, you have always like 15% of people who don't agree to the bigger ethics, but they don't matter. You have like the big majority of, let's say 70-80% would like basically agree that everybody should be treated equally. And then you can use this as a leverage for this productive polarization. But if you start with the ethics of, for example, people with this skin color are like treated better than people with the different skin color, then you cannot use this leverage of a shared ethics. Like the right wing maybe would do that. Like I can talk about the neo-Nazis in Germany who were thinking about deporting people that migrated even generations before, like the parents, the grandparents migrated to Germany, and now they want them to deport somewhere. So this is nothing a majority in Germany right now, like luckily, would ever agree on. Like, and the bigger ethics behind that, it's not shared in any way. So it doesn't work if you have a productive polarization. It'd be like, yeah, you can be either protagonist or antagonist in this case, and then the huge majority would be like, no, this is not working. Like then we're gonna be antagonist. And yeah, I hope it stays that way. I hope I'm right, and I hope it stays that way.
Thank you so much, everyone, for a free-flowing conversation. You touched on a lot of things that I wanted to interject on, but I think going a little farther back when we were talking about in terms of like effectiveness in protesting within like a system, you asked us about in terms of the 2024 election, how we feel about protesting against that. Something I noted that was interesting was the whole idea of this like utopian restructuring of the system, which is like very real, honestly. And I feel like a lot of activists do honestly feel burnt out in terms of like how far can we really go if the problem lies within the system, you know? So that was really interesting. And the question in terms of also what is winning, because I've never really thought about that even in my own activism. Like, what does it mean to win? Is it just passing a bill? But I feel like in a way that doesn't really feel like, you know, that authentic either. So, but thank you. Touching more on the polarization, cultural polarization we were just talking about, we see this a lot, honestly now more than ever, for the first time, like in society with everything being on social media now, we're really able to see like everyone's viewpoints and everyone has a platform in a way. And I know Elsa had a question about this and social media's role within democracy. So, I mean, Elsa, my bad. I think I said Emma.
You said Elsa, so
okay.
all good. At least I think you did. Yeah, I had a question about technology, which has been so instrumental in increasing and transforming political activity on both the right and the left. Have you, in your research, seen a difference in how the left is utilizing technology and social media to mobilize their protests versus the right? And do you view this technology as more of a driver of positive change, or can it also be a challenge to our democracy?
Oh, thank you, Elsa. That's again a $1 million to $1 billion question. If I had like the definite answer, no offense, I wouldn't be sitting here, but maybe in the White Office, Oval Office or White House. I think, like, very generally speaking, you could you could say that the left is using social media more productively and more to mobilize, and the right is very aggressively using it to intoxicate the discourse. And I think, unfortunately, very successfully. As Matt already straightened out, that the common ground of reality, the shared knowledge about what is the world, who runs it, it gets smaller and smaller. And I think it's the work of the troll farms, and I think it's the work of people making money in the end by intoxicating the discourse via social media. So this is definitely happening. On the other hand, I would recommend a very good book by Zeynep Tufekci. It's a New York Times staff writer and scientist, and it's called Twitter and Tear Gas. And she actually, during the Arab Spring, she actually very empirically tried to find out if like the rise of social media now helped these movements or did something else, because that's the first thought you have. Like, now we have Facebook and Twitter, and now we're going to topple every dictator in the world. Never really worked, like, especially in these countries, or at least like had ambivalent success. And so I think that the question is still out there. What I definitely would argue for is that, to me, still, like, these technological shifts are a big chance still, and because the costs of organizing and coordinating and communicating and mobilizing, like, they decrease so much that I would see it as kind of a cue, even kind of a privilege to live in an age where, compared to people in like the 1950s and 60s, like the civil rights movement, what they had to work on, first of all, in matters of communication, it was so much tougher that I think, before like thinking too much about how does it play out until now, what do the right wingers do, blah blah blah, just, like, I would say, just go out there and use it, and then it will all play out.
Thank you. To kind of touch on something that we kind of almost got to, but not fully, I feel like. Obviously, as we know, political engagement can become a very strenuous like endeavor, and burnout or loss of stamina is a real thing that a lot of fellow organizers and activists talk about. And with this, I know Matt had a question about if you could offer any thoughts or tips in finding hope and maintaining, honestly, self-care, even not only as, I feel like, an organizer, but just a civilian in such stressful times. So I'll hand over to Matt.
Yeah. And that's pretty much the question. I was just struck when I, again, was, reading through some of your work, that you brought up the idea of, and the importance of, and the centrality of hope quite often, and never wanting to lose sight of that, and encouraging people toward very concrete practices that would cultivate an enduring sense of hope. And again, maybe optimism is a little too shallow of a word, but something like that maybe urges us toward that capacity of sustaining a utopian vision, even in the midst of a lot of chaos or confusion or discouragement and burnout. So I was just wondering, what are some daily sources of hope that either you practice or that you've seen other people practice, or are they objects or even relationships that you have found helpful in your own life and in others' lives for beginning and sustaining personal political engagement?
Thank you. That's a very good thing to think about towards the end. I would really like to hear your thoughts or like hear your answer, like what gives you hope, because I need other people also. Like I'm not waking up every day and be like, yeah, today's the day we're gonna change the world. It doesn't work like this. So first of all, I think that's the point that Zora just articulated again briefly. Defining your goals and define achievable goals. I mean, I think we struggle with that in life generally, like being like, yeah, I want to work something meaningful. I want to find my big love. I want to have a big healthy family. I want to be useful for the community, and then I want to change the world politically. These are all like huge things to achieve. So break down whatever you like, whatever gives you the sense of a just cause, of fight. Like take your moral injury, take that thing that bothers you in the world, and then break it down to tiny pieces and be like, okay, what can I really achieve with maybe even my friends? Like start with something like that. And now, like I would say, like the best like the direct route into the burnout is always thinking of these huge global things that you can never, of course, you can never achieve like in 1 year alone or with a small group of people. So that's first of all it. I think humor is something that's useful to me, and what's giving me hope again and again is that, like, working in this field, writing this book, talking to you guys, it's not a feeling. I can, like, it's empirical data in a way. There are many people out there who feel like these injustices, yeah, who have this moral injury and who would like really would like to change the world, but they don't know how. And this is something we can change. This is something we can change together. Show people how, and then I want to see what happens as soon as more people embrace the tactics of protest and feel powerful and actually do something. But again, I would be very curious about your best remedies against hopelessness.
I really like that question of, what gives us hope, especially I know all of us, even if we're not we not necessarily label ourselves as activists, but I know all of us, at least on the council, do care about, making a change. And I'd say for me specifically, because I also want to turn this question to my fellow council members, so maybe give them some time to think. For me specifically, honestly, I feel like, I don't know, things do feel very big in terms of political engagement and, like, I don't know, and all the stuff. And I feel like in the midst of all of it, it's important to remember at the end of the day, like, we are all, human. And honestly, I feel like to make things more small, what gives me hope is honestly just those little fleeting moments of human interaction. And I mean, I live in New York City, and Emma, I know you go to Columbia, and so I feel like, especially in the city like New York, that's like so big and like all different types of people, I feel like in the midst of, people on their commute and just minding their business, those little moments of someone just like smiling at you in the subway, or like maybe like doing a good deed, a stranger doing a good deed for you, or like I really like complimenting strangers specifically. I feel like those small moments of like humanity and just remembering that, and they were just kind of like all trying our best here, trying to be good people. At least I would hope the most of us are. Honestly, I'd say that's what feels refreshing for me in the midst of things feeling so big sometimes, because at the end of the day, we're all just kind of going day by day and, trying our best. So I don't know what everyone else thinks, but that's my answer.
I thought that was really beautiful, and I don't think there's a movement that's too small as well. I mean, I don't think anyone is expecting students to change the entire American political system. I think community-based organizing and action is really important as well, whether that's in your neighborhood or your academic setting. So yeah, I think sometimes people get a little flustered or overwhelmed by everything ever, but I think starting small is also really important, and that overlooking like smaller, more communal changes within your community are just as important as sort of these nationwide or even worldwide movements as well.
So, sorry, Matt. Yeah, sorry, like a New York thing for sure. Because my immediate answer was like, yes, the eye contact I made with the mom on the subway today is like that's giving me hope. But I think an even smaller answer, and this is like half a joke, but also quite serious, is I have a cat. And he gives me hope because he's just an animal, like we all are, like living in harmony with the world that he exists in. And like there's something about seeing an animal and like being aware that you are also an animal existing really naturally in a space that I'm like, if we could all just tap in a little bit more to like what it means to be alive and just like do the things that our bodies need to get through the day, maybe just like think a little bit less intensely about what's going on and just let like natural, I don't know, now that I'm saying it, it sounds funny, but I get hope from watching my cat interact with the world.
No, I think that's really beautiful. And it reminds me of this one British American poet named Denise Levertov, who wrote a lot about burnout as she protested the Vietnam War. And one of the things that she came away with as she was in protest and inhaling tear gas and suffering alongside all of these other activists was that she was just one form of life that wanted to live next to other forms of life that also wanted to live. And so when I'm looking at areas of suffering, I'm often thinking through that lens of like, we want to live. And there's something so beautiful about that, even in context of intense, genocide and suffering. You find people even using gratuitous acts of simple kindness that still can exist in those moments. And one of the things that gives me hope is actually one of her quotes as she was wrestling with her own burnout, as she stopped finding the world beautiful. And as a poet, you can imagine that might be stressful. And she realized that she was so overwhelmed by the ugliness in the world that she was refusing to acknowledge that the warm blanket she was under was something beautiful. The cat was something beautiful, that there were these simple, beautiful things around her. And by becoming unable to acknowledge them as beautiful anymore, it wasn't doing anything to stop the suffering. And it was only cutting her off from something that might sustain her in her own pursuit of justice. And I just keep thinking about that as like a thing I check with myself every day is like, am I still capable of really understanding the world around me as beautiful and good, even as I refuse to look away from a lot of the horror and injustice in the world as well. And we have to be able to hold those two in tension. Otherwise, I think we lose a part of what both makes us human and makes us able to sustain ethical action in the world.
Thank you everyone for such beautiful and hopeful answers. And to conclude, I just wanted to mention that I noticed on your website, you mentioned a few times that within your interdisciplinary studies, you focus on reading, writing, and speaking, and your desk being your spaceship. And I thought that, I just want to say, I thought that was very beautiful, especially as a writer myself. And I feel like ending on this note of all of us just trying our best and trying to make our voices heard, especially as young people. I don't know, that gives me hope, honestly. So if you have any final thoughts, just to give you one last chance before we conclude. But otherwise, thank you so much, Friedemann.
Thanks so much. I hope you take something away from this talk. I definitely do. I do this kind of interviews because I learn so much from the questions and from your thoughts, and this is why I say thank you for having me.
And thank you. And to conclude, I want to mention that our next interview is March 27th at 4 p.m. with Tristan Ezidor, a social activist and the youngest member of the Culver City School Board. So please tune in for that. But otherwise, thank you so much for a great evening, and thank you again, Friedemann.